Final Fantasy VII came out in 1997. That means at the time of making this video, the game is 26 years old. Now, surely with such an age span, everything is known about the game, right? Well, here are 5 things I bet you don't know. Let's start with how in development, according to Tetsuya Nomura, the game only had Ereth as the main heroine in the story, and Tifa became a member of the main cast much later in the game. Interestingly, the team also had to choose between Ereth and Tifa for the iconic death scene. Now, concept-wise, fans might notice that Ereth and Sephiroth have similar hairstyles in the original game. The dev team deliberately went with this design choice when early script drafts intended for Sephiroth and Ereth to actually be brother and sister. Then, when the team kept Ereth's hair, they also had to give her the one-piece dress she wears for polygon conservation. Moreover, at a different time, the team then considered Ereth and Sephiroth to be lovers at some point. However, the team managed to add Zack's role as Ereth's first love later in the development stage. Also, speaking of Zack, this takes us to our next fact. The dev team added Zack Fair much later in the game. In fact, the plot had already decided his role in Cloud's life. The team agreed Cloud is just faking his personality early on. However, they eventually decided that Cloud should instead base his personality on somebody else. Unfortunately, the team had no one in mind. Even when Ereth says she saw her first love in Cloud, Zack filled in this role as Ereth's first love, as well as the basis of Cloud's personality. It was Kazushige Nojima, the game's scenario writer, that would create Zack. After his creation, Nojima asked the team to add foreshadowing to Zack's true role in the story. But the story itself also ended up going through major revisions as well. And in fact, its original concept is entirely different to what we got. So, fact number 3 is how Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi had already written a scenario for the game. This early outline is still recognizable as Final Fantasy VII, but is framed as a detective story. Tetsuya Nomura, Final Fantasy VII's character and battle visual director, recalled the scenario in Polygon's oral history, and I quote, "In the first plot treatment that Sakaguchi-san wrote, it took place in New York. There was an organization there that was trying to destroy the Mocha reactors, and a character named Detective Joe was investigating them. There were other characters involved too. One of the members of this organization trying to destroy the reactor was the prototype character for the eventual FF7 main character, Cloud." Also, talking to IGN in 2012, Nomura also mentioned this story, referring to the investigator as hot-blooded Detective Joe. This character never made it into the final version, but the plot is recognizable as the blueprint for the opening hours of Final Fantasy VII, just it's set in the fictional Midgar rather than New York City. Now, on to number 4. You all likely know about the connection between Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VII with how they are set in the same universe. It's just FF7 takes place 1000 years into the future and on a different planet. But did you know this connection is established in the FF7 remake? When exploring the Shinra Building Museum exhibit in Final Fantasy VII Remake, you can find a framed photograph of Shinra employees. All look like regular people in suits, aside from the person in the center, who is wearing an unusual helmet. You may recognize this as being Al-Bhed in design. This is a reference to the Final Fantasy X-2 character Shinra, an Al-Bhed who was researching life force. This image is a fun little Easter egg, but Square has constantly hinted for years that the worlds of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X are linked. In the Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega, the segment on Shinra reads, "Maybe one day his descendants will establish a company that supplies the energy of the planet." In that same book, scenario writer Kazushige Nojima offers a theory that Shinra will investigate siphoning Mako energy from the far plane, and his ancestors will establish the Shinra Company 1,000 years later on another world. This photograph in Final Fantasy VII Remake essentially connects the dots. It might not make the link between FF7 and 10 canon, but it's certainly a knowing wink. Now, let's talk about the last one, which very well could have changed gaming history in its entirety. Final Fantasy VII is known as one of the definitive PlayStation games and a pioneer of 3D graphics in the 1990s. But during its early development, Final Fantasy VII was planned as a 2D game for the Super Famicom, otherwise known as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System outside of Japan. Talking to Polygon as part of the oral history of Final Fantasy VII, game director Yoshinori Kitase said, and I quote, "At the time, it wasn't clear yet whether Japanese RPGs were going to go 3D or not. Final Fantasy creator Sakaguchi-san was especially fond of pixel art, and we debated a lot about whether we should remain in that 2D style. After we finished Final Fantasy VI, we began working on Final Fantasy VII as a 2D game for the Super Famicom, brainstorming and holding initial planning meetings. At that time, Square was also developing Chrono Trigger, its ambitious time travel RPG. The project required more hands though, and so the small team working on Final Fantasy VII was actually moved over to help on Chrono Trigger. This caught short the SNES version of Final Fantasy VII just a few months into its development. And then, when the team came back to Final Fantasy VII, it was decided to be on PS1 instead. And there we go, a nice look into a behind the scenes for Final Fantasy VII. So tell me, did you know all of these 5 facts? Or did some of them catch you off guard? Let me know down below in the comments. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, then please be sure to smash that like button, as it really helps out the channel. As always, though, everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.